Javier Milei, a too big pill for Tim Morata's vile burst of a nigger's lynch, age. We Argentinians have been transiting for decades in extreme danger. Political speeches are anachronistic and failed wherever you look at them. Everyone suffers from this situation, but especially the most vulnerable. From a short time to this part, Javier Milei raps on the political stage with a counter-current discourse and proposes nothing more and nothing less than freedom. With a depth not seen for a long time in our midst. With what has influenced many and has run the talk of other political circles. Milei reiterates that he has come to awaken lions and not to lead lambs. That his presence is transitory and that the ideals are relevant and not the people. He vigorously combats collectivism in all its forms, and to counter the formula of proposals that in this text, we are going to summarize the brief flight, some few of them, to the effect of illustrating the positions that this party represents. We do it in the form of a decalogue. First, the environmentalists. From a short time to this part, the socialists have been enamored with so-called environmentalism as a more effective way to eliminate private property. Instead of decreeing its abolition in the Marxist style, the tragedy of the commons is more effective. When it comes to the stakeholder rights and to the idea of public property, giving anyone the right to control that which belongs to another. The founder and first CEO of Weather Channel, John Corman, the Nobel Prize in Physics, Albert G. Ebel, and the former president of Greenpeace of Canada, Patrick Maurer, maintain that the so-called environmentalism is based on a fraud of fake statistics. The increase in the temperature on the planet has risen by 0.5 degree in the course of the last century, and it was before so-called greenhouse gases were injected by humans in the atmosphere. Mainly carbon dioxide appeared in the era of dinosaurs. The level of carbon dioxide was between 5 and 10 times higher than the current, which contributed to the richness of vegetation, times when the earth was sometimes hotter and wet, and others of high cooling and dryness. It is true that many marine species are on the verge of extinction, due to the aforementioned tragedy of the commons. This does not happen with cows today, although it was not always like that. In the colonial era, in much of Latin America, the cattle population was almost extinguished, because anyone who found an animal could kill it, swallow it, and leave the rest in the field for the bird of prey. The same happened with buffaloes in the United States. This changed when the advances of the time began to be used. Branding cattle and sheep ear markings later clarified the property rights. The same with elephants in Zimbabwe. Before signing property rights to the herd, elephants were left to be slaughtered for their ivory. As for the fear of the disappearance of water, the Nobel Prize for Economy, Bernard Smith writes, water has become a good whose quantity and quality is too important to leave it in the hands of political authorities. The third planet is covered with water, although most of it is salty or is blocked by ice. However, there is annual rainfall on land of 113,000 cubic kilometers, of which 72,000 evaporate. That leaves a net of 41,000, a figure capable of easily covering the needs of the world's population. However, millions of deaths are produced by contaminated and scarce water. It happens in Cambodia, Rwanda and Haiti. This is due to the politicization of collection, processing and distribution of water. In those countries, the precipitation is several times higher than that of Australia, where these policies do not take place, and consequently, such tragedies do not occur in Australia. In other words, with the pretense of taking care of the property, the institution of the property rights are destroyed via the aforementioned figures, and has severely damaged to the planet. Second, the central bank. His policy can only be directed in one of three directions: expansion, contraction, or leave the monetary base unchanged. Any of these pass distort relative prices, which are the only indicators to operate in the market. So a loss is stimulated that inevitably negatively affects salaries and incomes in real terms. For this reason, it is essential to eliminate the central bank, allowing people to reveal their preference in terms of the monetary asset, as has been suggested once and again by the Nobel Prize Friedrich Hayek, among others. Third, to have legislation and labour market compatible with a free society that does not require the hiring of union workers, the abrogation of the fascist union personality, with all the abuses that it entails to the dismay of genuine workers, and the release of a pathetic and systematic monumental scam, encrusted by a nefarious system of antisocial retirement insecurity. Fourth, in relation to abortion, in accordance with what was designated by international renowned geneticists, and with what was expressed by the National Academy of Medicine of our country, the child to be born, scientific and biologically, is a human being whose existence begins at the moment of conception. Sometimes it has been sustained that the mother is the owner of her body, which is absolutely true, but she is not the owner of the body of another. It is true that she is in power of many things, like any human being regardless of his age. So it constitutes a superlative arbitrariness, inventing a moment of gestation to proceed to the liquidation of that human life, as if a magical mutation were produced in the species, which, being said by the way, is such an arbitrary logic that can lead to the justification of infanticide. A human embryo contains the entirety of the genetic information at the moment of the fusion of the male and female gametes, which respectively provide 23 chromosomes each. An E cell is formed composed of 46 chromosomes, which contains the entirety of the characteristics of the human being, only based on an inadmissible act of faith in the most rudimentary magic. Could it be sustained that 10 minutes after birth we are in front of a human being, but not 10 minutes before, as if before the birth that were a vegetable, or a mineral that suddenly changes nature? Does he maintain that in the maternal womb it would not be a human, in the same way that a seed is not a tree? Confuse crucial aspects. The seed belongs to the plant species, and is in power of being a tree, in the same way that the fetus belongs to the human species, and is in power of being an adult. Fifth, the distinction between businessmen who, to improve their patrimonial situation, must offer goods and services that meet the needs of their neighbour, regarding the former who, ally to the power of turn, exploit the misery of others through privileges of a different kind. Sixth, the insistence on preserving democracy in the style of the Giovanni Sartori of our time, and prevent it from becoming kleptocracy when its medullary aspect is unknown. Respect for the rights of all, instead of giving precedence to the mere grant of vote, as occurs in territories such as Venezuelan, which also allows gross frauds. 7. The transcendence of integration into the world via free trade of bribes. 8. The reduction of tax charges, to place them at the level of attending with prudence, security and justice. 9. Review the government organogram to the effect of reducing public spending in those jobs that exceed the specific mission of an open society, the way in which other Nobel Prize-winning economists, such as Milton Friedman, George Stigler and Gary Becker have also insisted, in this argumentary line, facilitate the implementation of genuine federalism and the consequent decentralization of power at all levels. And 10th, point to the non-renewal of external debt on the basis, on the one hand, of the fact that this implies compromising heritage of future generations that have not participated in the election of the government that contracted the debt, and on the other hand, limit the monopoly of the force to finance itself exclusively with present resources. Once the so-called monetary authority is eliminated, and the path of external debt is closed, which was exposed in the first place by the Nobel Prize in Economics winner James M. Buchanan, we already know that liberals are not a bunch, and that we detest groupthink. We expect differences of opinion, disagreements that we have with ourselves, when we review previous text, and we realize that we could have improved the brand. Since, as Borges said, there is no such thing as a perfect text, applicable to all orders of life, there are some comments that come from those who seem that they do not realize what country we live in and what is happening. But in the case of Milei, some of the criticisms thrown to run, in the first place, naturally, by the entire status spectrum, which radically dislikes freedom, but also by envious people who look for a screen and the first foot of the cat to disguise their bad faith and jealous growing ups in the midst of lying, also by those who cannot get rid of the politically correct or the ideas of liberalism or their entrance towards freedom. They are alarmed and estimate that the proposals of Mara are too big a pill to digest. However, if the ideas so solidly exposed by Milei were taken into practice, our country would once again be an example of the civilized world, as happened when the abortion blizzard were applied from the liberal constitution of 1853, which allowed the salaries of the rural people and the worker of new industry were much higher than those of Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. It was the reason why the population doubled every 10 years, and that we had equivalent indicators to those of the United States. Then came the fascist revolution of 1930, and from the military coup of 1943, status measures in various degrees have been applied continuously to our days, and therefore with successive crises that push down steps in all fields and possible areas, along with the growing degradation of Republican institutions. Javier Milei, in his previous incursion in academic fields, has shown great breadth and knowledge in the matters of his incumbency, with special reference to the extraordinary contributions of the Austrian school, led by great thinkers like Karl Menger at the beginning, and continued by Ludwig von Mises, Israel Kirchner, and Murray Rothbard, a legacy that this modern character of Argentine politics has transmitted with great efficiency to young generations, so that each one knows how to value their independence and individual autonomy. These features have been highlighted by the Economist from London, the Gazette from Madrid, the Mon from Paris, and the Country of Montevideo, which also underscored the eminent immoral character of this undertaking. Finally, and to close this brief note, it's pertinent to highlight that one thing is the necessary stretch of electoral bridges with parallel spaces to avoid falling into the clutches of local chauvinism, and another very different one is the behavior of a liberal in Congress, who must manifest his independence and not proceed to the voting block, turning the parliament into a desk in which everyone proceeds like monkeys in a cage which does not take a stand against the vernacular statism. This independence of Argentine legislators was one of the features that the representatives of the French Academy emphasized with admiration when they visited us for the reason of the centenary celebration in 1910. Asterisk. Upwards of an excellent age. He is a doctor in economics and a doctor in direction sciences, academician of the National Academy of Economic Sciences. He was a professor and first leader of SE, a position that he served for 23 years. After his resignation, he was praised by the new authorities, Professor Emerito and Dr. Honoris Causa. He is president of the section Economic Sciences of the National Academy of Sciences of Buenos Aires, member of the Institute of Methodology of Social Sciences of the National Academy, member of the Consultative Council of the Institute of Economic Affairs of London, academic associate of Father Institute in Washington, member of the Academic Council of Ludwig von Mises Institute in Auburn, member of the Honor Committee of the Rosario Foundation in Twitter, as of Ennick's Lynch _ his version of the text published in the info portal on November 27, 2021, The Path of the Libertarian, The Path in the First Person, One, The Beginning, The Decision, and the first paper, I was born on October 22, 1970, in the bosom of a middle-class family. The Libertarian, the one who I am now, did it just a while later. I remember 11 years ago, in April 1982, I was listening to the famous phrase by Lawrence Segal, the one he bets, the dollar leases. That was the beginning of the debacle, the model of the changeable tablet, and only that it was also the moment in which I discovered that there were many people who in my country were impoverished, overwhelmed, and it was because of their debts. Times of the circular 1050, at that moment suddenly, and as a result of the liquefaction, people who were fine went to impoverished and vice versa. Although in the aggregate everything was worse, something had happened. Something had changed the way of life to many people in a substantial way. I was always very attentive to that, problems that my parents had with their friends, with their relatives, or with the parents of my schoolmates. I saw those interactions and also the fluctuations in the levels of life, fluctuations that were basically linked to the changes of the economy, and that impacted it all so much. Me as a child, everyone in a certain way, noticed that they lived worse and more attentive to the economy. Me too. In fact, it was at that moment that I decided if the things that happened with the dollar, with inflation, with the economy in general affected the well-being of people, I had to understand how it worked. I obviously had to study it. But not only did the economy arouse interest in me, by then he was a boy marked by the 78 World Cup and Mario Alberto the Killer Kemps and Yeboda Mataldo the Duck Vijo. The Duck, whom I had the opportunity to meet and hug, is one of my greatest idols. In fact, it was such an influence that I had over me that I did not doubt it at any time. If it was football, my place within a field was the arch. And it was despite the fact that my characteristics were not the most appropriate for Ngali. My height is 180 meters. However, it was precisely those characteristics that made me, when I played in Chacarita Genius, train much more. And thanks to such a level of training, 6 hours a day, when I was in the goal, I jumped and left the crossbar at chest height. I flee from stick to stick without difficulty. This is not a minor fact, since it marks a trait of personality. The goalie not only dresses differently, 10 with the same uniform and one totally different, and he can use his hands inside the large area, but also has his own training. He plays with the tribune on his back all the time. He usually celebrates goals in solitude, and he is the only one who, when he makes a mistake, pays with a goal against. Obviously, it should be clear that being a goalie requires a very particular personality. As caused by two passions, the economy and the goal, I grew intelligent in 1989. While I was studying the first year of my degree in economics at the University of Belgrano, my mother asked me to accompany her to the supermarket. I remember as if it were today. Full hyperinflation. I was leaning with my arms on that. It was a moment of enormous confusion. Everything that my eyes were seeing was inconsistent with what I had been studying at the university. Something evident for a first course of economics in my career. The prices went up, but the demand did not go down. People kept throwing themselves on top of the products trying to get them out. So while I was watching that movie, I thought, what I'm studying at the university is wrong, or I'm a fool who doesn't understand anything. So I assumed that, by spending 6 hours a day training football, I wasn't studying enough to understand the nature of the problem. And it was right there that I decided to leave football and start studying economics in the super intensive way. I started reading a lot of books beyond the material they gave me at college. I could say that I started a self-taught education process. And at the age of 20, I wrote my first paper called Hyperinflation and Distortion in the Markets. In that article, basically from my intuition, I ended up deriving a model of adaptive expectations, which allowed me to derive a curve of added supply with a negative slope, instead of positive or vertical. And that made the success of increases in the added demand. The result of the tax deficit financed with the monetary printing generated an equilibrium where not only did the prices go up, but also the economy was contracting, where the characteristic of the equilibrium was its stability, because the higher the prices, the demand curve became more elastic. And although the supply curve was inverted, it was much less elastic than demand. Then it generated an equilibrium that not only existed, and was unique by the linearity of the supply and demand functions resulting, but was also stable. Thus, at the age of 20, I explained the hyperinflationary process that implied that the presence of the inflationary acceleration derived from a hyperinflation also generated contraction of quantities. That is, drop in GDP, drop in production, drop in employment, and drop in real wages. In parallel, and to perfect my histrionic beta, along with Hernan Boraxia, a drummer, with whom we have been in great friendship for 10 years, we decided to build a tribute band to the Rolling Stones. We added the talented guitarist Juan Carlos Marioni and Diego Avila, bass, and finally Diego Paris on rhythm guitar, would join us to complete the quintet. My place in the band was that of a vocalist who tried to replicate the role of Mick Jagger in the biggest rock band in the world. With my step through music, the same thing happens as with football. Those who saw and accompanied the process say it was good. My perception was not so optimistic. The the study of Keynesianism. I received a master's degree at the Institute for Economic and Social Development at the University of Belgrano. Like any study, has its content regulated, so that, when I finished my degree, I graduated with the typical analytical structure of the left center, with post-Keynesian structuralists. I was one who believed that inflation is multi-causal, that the presence of the state regulating the economy is important, that there is a prominent role for the central bank, and the state has to intervene in certain markets, such as the exchange rate, among other things. However, despite my current vision, I do not deny that, because it is precisely what allows me today to embrace the ideas of freedom with more strength. The truth is that, as a post-Keynesian with structuralist tints, I decided to do a master's degree at the Institute for Economic and Social Development, where I study Keynesianism in depth. There are excellent professors. I say Marie Fanelli, Jorge Strapp, Mario Damo, Robert A. Franco, Guillermo Rosenbresso, Luis Acosta, Fabian Avedi, and Javier Finkman, among others. I studied different variants of Keynesianism. In fact, I became very close friends with Javier Finkman, and he took me as a microeconomic assistant to the University of Buenos Aires. At the same time as being Javier's assistant, I met a professor at the University of Buenos Aires, Daniel Perez Henry, and he offered me to be his assistant at Macro. This is very interesting because at that time the microeconomic analysis was on one side, the growth field in which years later I specialized. It was on the other, and the macroeconomics on the other. However, given my time restrictions and the work possibilities that I was provided to work on regulation issues and analysis and evaluation of companies, I decided to take the macro course. I got more into the topic of microeconomics, and I began to do a thorough tour on microeconomics issues, which in the end ended in the analysis of general balance, the same field of application of macro, but with micro foundations. In the midst of all this, the possibility arose of writing an article at the University of Belgrano, as a part of a team led by William J. Baumol, twice candidate for the Nobel Prize in Economics, Alfredo Becker and Alfredo Juan Canes, co-ed a job in which there was a lot of micro application, because it showed the disputability of the foreign market, which was then very important for all the regulatory issues that, for me, would have to become a source of life. In fact, I participated in the defense of Argentina in 5 cases in the Information System and Economic Data Analysis, the International Center for Differences, after having worked on the evaluation of companies in HSBC, to then move to maximum retirement and pension fund administrators, also working as an economist, to later take off as an economist coordinator of the broader study. In fact, it was in the context of my work in HSBC that, so that the task would be more fun, what I did was give the documents many micro foundations, which meant using the economic theory intensively. But the truth, despite the fact that it was very good in macro, in macro I always criticized it. There is something that didn't work. So one day, in the midst of a deep self-criticism, and given the connection I had with Alfredo Canes, I began to do the postgraduate in economics at the University of Torquato de Tella. Through I study in the Datella, a more eclectic master. Tired of messing so much with the families of Keynesian and structuralist models, I enter the Datella. There I begin to see the macro-modern, which was basically the general intertemporal equilibrium, something that I had already been studying for my Hernan for a long time. And that is when I become a recalcitrant neoclassical, absolutely orthodox. At that time the theory of real cycles was in fashion, which, in terms of the analytical approach, micro-fundamental intertemporal macroeconomics, is a kind of Austrian school but with a lot of mathematics. In that framework, the cycles are caused by exogenous factors where, except for the presence of some kind of market failure, there was no rule for monetary policy, neutrality of money, nor for tax policy, were Cardian equivalents. The only thing that these policies could do was damage. However, the problem, from my point of view, is that this analysis is built on the neoclassical paradigm, and when you enter the market failures, the socialist and door box opens, the results were much more comfortable. There was still something that did not quite right. I felt that I had some mathematically aesthetically beautiful models, while empirically adjusted. But they lacked thought, they lacked the soul. They enjoyed an empty beauty. Without a doubt, I keep beautiful memories of my time in that Itala, where I have had the possibility to study, listen, and now meet wonderful teachers. Pablo Garati, Guillermo Cabo, Hobo Cinquenti, Daniel Heyman, Giulio Bolinsky, Anna Martina Mental, and Leonardo Gasparini. Obviously, a separate chapter is desired by the mathematicians, Diego Ryle and Pablo Askew, people with a unique talent to do something very easy that does not look like such. I learned so much from each one of them, in the same way that my teachers from IDs in UB, Juan Carlos de Pablo. When I was very young, and unlike my dear Facundo Menes, my father did not force me to watch Time for Nevo, the program of Bernardo Neustadt. I watched it alone. Through that wonderful cycle, I have seen great thinkers. Among them, there was one for whom I felt great admiration, someone who explained easily what seemed difficult in the math of others. Juan Carlos de Pablo, the teacher. The teacher was in an auditorium. It was easy. It was full of bout after bout. In that sense, I grew up and developed professionally, admiring a true giant of dissemination. And again, life gave me a beautiful gift. I was in Tucumán at a meeting of the Argentine Association of Political Economy. I presented my work on tax sustainability and uncertainty. I remember that my exhibition was scary. And while I saw that the audience was not following me, I went to a flip chart and began to do the mathematical demonstrations right there. Why? If things were coming wrong, I made it even worse. If it weren't for the commentator Ernesto Rush, surely no one would have caught anything. I had a fever that was flying. I was furious, and at lightning speed I went to the elevator to return to my room and locked myself up. In that context, I braced against the mirror of the elevator, with my beard and glasses on. That was inside the cabin. He says to me, "Stop by, what's going on?" My answer was sharp. "I'm a fool. I just went to the garden." That person answers me, "Stop a little, calm down." And at that moment I realized that I was in the elevator with Juan Carlos de Pablo. There, the professor says to me, "I'll give you 5 floors so you can tell me the same, but like a little story." I realized that what I had not achieved in 20 minutes, I got it out in 5 floors of elevator. We got to the 5th floor and the professor said to me, "Good paper, do you realize that you can explain it well? Call me at the office next week and we'll have lunch together." We ended up becoming friends. We have had parties together. I have learned and I learn a lot in each talk. In fact, when I started to have presence in the media showing my less friendly face, one day he calls me to meet and tells me, "If you continue like this, you will end up as an expert." And I answered him, "Then I will be like an expert with a wig. Then I would also meet Jose Luis, someone to whom all liberals should thank for the achievement of bringing liberalism back to the electoral contest. Expert has a lot of merit in the present liberal avalanche. It may be that unfairly many only look at a point in time. I know well how the exponential function works. The arrival at the broader studio, the passage through the act involved a radical change. I felt much more comfortable with the new structure. So much so that I wrote again. In that context, I present a work on the sustainability of fiscal policy for the meeting of the Argentine Association of Political Economy of 2001. At that time in Argentina, the fiscal issue and the change were at the top of the agenda. On the one hand, there were those who proposed to pacify and devalue, so that the liquefaction of pesos and the destruction of real salaries, especially in dollars, led to recover the economy annihilated by the alliance. On the other hand, we were the ones who wanted a fiscal adjustment that should fall into politics. 'Tis the debate ring. After the hard work during 2002 and 2003 at maximum average, fortune again knocked on my door. At the beginning of 2004, Dr. Miguel Angel Broder offered me to work as an economic coordinator in this study, a task shared with his daughter Andrea. Although I was there for 4 months, the experience was wonderful. I learned the work of the real professional economist. I had left the side of the sermon, in which I received the reports from the consultants, to whom I make cosmetic reviews, more or less valid from the theoretical, but cosmetic in the end, to be on the side of those he wrote. In principle, it seemed easy. I had published 2 very good articles in field of tax sustainability, with concrete contributions for cases without 2001, and with uncertainty 2002. And very especially, I had published one that I still consider one of my best academic articles of my career, up to more sovereign debt under asymmetric information. There, in the middle of the negotiation of the debt default in 2002, acclaimed and celebrated by the political establishment as if, before the collapse of a company, the employees who would be unemployed would celebrate the event, although the body never pays the costs. I began to develop the analytical structure of the bonus, with the coupon tied to the perceived investment value. Until that moment, the theoretical developments were very bad, since they implied that where a country was going wrong, the financing dollars rained on it, while if things were going well, it was so absurd they had to pay that they fell into default. A ridiculous result. That is why, at work, a dynamic debt contract was developed that incorporated the problems of asymmetric information with the relevant restrictions on participation and compatibility of incentives. And his result was a coupon tied to the perceived investment value, with a roof and a floor. This says, when the economy is doing well, it does not fall into default. And when the economy is doing poorly, it hardly receives all the funding it seeks. However, despite my enormous ease with mathematics, and especially with how fun it was for me, and it is for me to be and use one of the formulas, the challenge of the blank sheet every week was far from simple. He had to be looking at the data all the time, find something new and that was relevant. In turn, the competition was looking for the same thing. So, if one arrived late, and see if he could improve it so as not to be at the debate. Every week it was clear how easy it was to criticize, and how difficult it was to build. But after a while I simulated the dynamic of work. At that time, 2004, in Argentina it was discussed if it was possible for the government to pursue a goal in the type of real change. Literature pointed out that it was not possible, since if the central bank set the exchange above the level of equilibrium, the second part of the book will be understood by the use of quotes. The income of this would lead to an expansion of the monetary offer that would raise prices, and then the type of real change would be appreciated. On the other hand, if the type of change was released, the price of the foreign currency would be aligned with the amount of money and the level of prices. This is, the government could not do anything to have a competitive type of change from which to promote economic growth, and economic growth led by exports. Beyond that, the debate was raised in those times, and many proposed what today would define as the violent solution, the capital controls. The idea was that the central bank could decouple the control of the type of change and the level of prices by restricting the income on capital. Naturally, this solution does not seem nice to me. This is the monetary dilemma thinking of a problem to Jan Timbergen. This is a problem of incompatibility in the amount of instruments and objectives. Basically, Timbergen's theorem says that if you have economic policy objectives, at least you have to have independent economic policy instruments. To control the type of real change meant to control two prices, and therefore two economic policy instruments are needed. One to control the type of change, and another to control the prices. Then I discovered that the problem is a trilemma, having an instrument of economic policy, and there appear two versions. On the one hand, the heterodox version of capital control, while I propose a tax policy against cyclic. This is if the monetary policy was subordinate to the control of the type of change to compensate for the effects on the level of prices. Obviously, the result was that if you wanted to have a real competitive change, and you wanted to win in competitiveness, the tax policy had to run so that the level of prices was at its peak. The result is not bad. But today I am nauseous about the level of violence and fatal conceit that economic policy implies. It happens that I had not yet been introduced to Mary Newton Rothbard, the author of The Throne. This is a significant contribution. To do things like these is to hire. The presence of other people in the place was the indication that he should renounce. The decision was already made. However, given the enormous workload that it involved, the assembly of the monthly cycle, I told Miguel Angel my decision the next day. He took his hand at work, and I answered him. It takes two to tango, and if the other part does not want to dance, it is impossible. We looked at each other, we understood each other. We shook hands and I left, with an enormous and eternal gratitude for Dr. Miguel Angel Broda, who taught me the trade and to earn my life as an economist. Sometime later, in a chat with Jose Luis Esper, who had also passed through the studio, I told him this and the teacher told me, "This studio is a great school. I do not know anyone who has passed through there in an important position. That would not be good for him in his professional life." The expression was a little more harsh, but I imagine that the teacher would not be bothered with the sweet version. In fact, the legend tells that one day Dr. Broda pointed out in a chat, I could give them a title to those who passed through in my studio. Strictly, I never heard such a thing. If Dr. Broda came to say that, I would believe that he's right. I confess that this is a very emotional moment of the book, and I even feel that I am not expressing all my gratitude towards the studio and the months I was there, but that's why I'm not a writer and I'm just an economist who likes to write and divulge the fundamentals of economic analysis. 5. After darkness comes light. Although the valuation of the passage to Broda's studio grows with the passage of time, the speech of Steve Jobs comes to mind about the points of life can only be joined from front to back. At that time, it was a riot that was not free of cost. The demand for time that the studio implied had led me to break up with a partner, and also, when the weekend arrived, I did not feel like a social life. In turn, re-accommodation in the labour markets. With the mountain of regulations, it was not easy, and that led me to start a job that was not ideal, but that served to pay the bills. In parallel, in front of the gym that had given me the passage to Broda's studio, I write again in Tinsui, and I find myself with a level of productivity that I had never seen in my life. The road began with the academic version of what I had presented to Dr. Broda at the end of my stay at the studio. The name of the article was Real Exchange Rate Targeting, Capital Control or Fiscal Policy. The paper would be published by the Economy magazine of the National University of Cordoba, and when I traveled to the Mediterranean province to expose the article, I came across the best decision I've ever made in my life. At the hotel where I stayed, I met to have lunch with the owner of an English mastic nursery. After the talk, we headed to his house, where Kuma's children were, and there I found the true and greatest love of my life, Conan. The puppies were 30. The one came to me almost immediately. Conan had already chosen me. I did not resist. I had to wait for him to come with me to Buenos Aires. I went on vacation in February to fill Carlos Paz, so that I could finish the rest of returning to capital with my four-legged little boy. The light came on. A few days later, Conan got sick. I had to put him in an intensive care clinic, luckily very close to work. So, at lunchtime, I visited him. In the middle, a friend of my mother gave me a stem. Other side of just an urgent causes, the miraculous saint expired. After crying and praying for a couple of weeks, Karen passed the test. He was very weak, but eager to fight. Everything returned to normal when I was working. Although I had never lowered my productivity, and they did not want to have to deal with my potential personal problems, unilaterally they proposed to me to go down half the time the hours worked, and thus reduce my salary to half. I did not have many short-term alternatives. I accepted it and took advantage of the free time to be with Conan. We lived almost with the right, but the combination of his affection and my passion for the economy writing made me want to go back to the old days. In fact, I will never forget the day when, in the face of a job I was doing, I happened to say in a loud voice a phrase by Albert Einstein, "Everything that is optimal. Since if it weren't, it would be different." The strange thing was that, in the face of it, Conan stood up and began to howl like a wolf. Something he keeps doing every time I repeat that phrase. I was listening to opera, especially those of Bellini and Donizetti, which were performed by the great Joan Sutherland, one of the three greatest divas in the history of lyrical music, along with Marie Callas and Renata Tebaldi, and directed by her husband, the great Richard Bunninge. Conan retreats to the kitchen. It was a context of great austerity, but with a lot of what makes me happy. However, when I returned from vacation, they asked me again for a new reduction of the salary, shortening the amount of hours again. It seemed like insane to me. I did not accept it. It seemed so low and miserable to me. What that imply who I judged did to me since it was not formalized. Obviously, I won. However, the thing was difficult, and as the studies showed, that person took about 2 years to find a job again. I adopted a pessimistic position and divided the amount of compensation as to survive 4 years. That gave a monthly figure that, subject to Conan still having the best living conditions possible, allowed me to spend the equivalent of a pizza per day. I could eat a pizza per day, and I did. Obviously, I came to weigh 120 kilos. But the important thing was, and always is, that Conan was fine. If Conan is fine, everything is fine. My commitment to Conan the dogs are the noblest beings in the universe. They never fail. They never make mistakes. When I lost my job back in 2004, Conan was already with me. The situation was complex. I was on the down and out, and everyone kicked while I was down. Some even seemed to take shifts kicking me. The only ones who were always with me were Conan and my sister Corina. One Sunday, already during the management of chronic kidney failure, I was at my parents' house. I had gone to visit them for a while, and instead of staying to watch Jorge Lanota's program at their house, I decided to go back to my grocery store. That's how I used to dine with Conan. Since I had been absent all afternoon, while I was watching a program, the light went out. I checked if it was my apartment, but no, it was something general. In the midst of the paranoia in which we lived, I came to think that the light cut had to do with the fact that they had shut down the program till another. At the time of the light cut, I was to not be able to breathe. It was impossible. There was a huge cloud of black smoke, so I went back to the apartment. Breathing became more and more complicated at every moment, and I remember that Conan went to the balcony and lay down, because the air was better. For me, outside or inside, it was very difficult. The reason: there was a fire in the building. Suddenly the neighbors called me saying, "Get out of the apartment, get out as best you can." I went out with Conan and they answered me, "Leave him." I turned off the phone, and at that moment I decided this: I was either leaving without Conan or I was going to die if I stayed with him. But nothing in the world I was going caused me to abandon him. I confess that Conan doesn't easily make a lot of trouble for nothing. He does everything well even without me telling him to. It's like he knows everything. However, with the topic of the walk, it is not easy to manage a joy or almost 100 kg mastiff. In that context, I told him, "I need you to listen to me this time, because in this is a life and death situation." Tremendously disciplined, he stood next to me and allowed me to put a strap on without turning around. It was difficult, but once we left the apartment, everything turned out to be much simpler. We went down the 10 floors by ladder almost without drama. When we arrived, between glass and broken masonry, a firefighter helped me take him to UPA. But as I was going to another height, I inhaled a lot of smoke, and when I went down I was cyanotic. So they grabbed me and put me in an ambulance to give me oxygen while I was calling the vet, Miguel during emergency operations. A guy who, as a friend, I loved enormously, and who I always remember in the best way. When I saw Miguel's car pass by, I left the ambulance and ran to take Conan to the vet to check that he was okay. I remember that he told me, "Conan is phenomenal. The problem is that you are blue," with which he ended up assisting me and giving me oxygen in the veterinary, because indeed the one he was sick with me. For me, that is one of the most important days of my life, because I have always told Conan that I was and I am willing to give my life for him at all times, under any circumstance, and before any event. And that day I fulfilled that promise. Meanwhile, I began to buy food in the supermarket, and that allowed me to adopt a healthier diet. So I quickly lost about 20 kilos. I was still overweight, but on the right track. Conan was still fine, and I was eager to write. So again, everything was going well. I was running out of money. I found a new job. Sometimes I think I had to go through the experience and that trial with the employers. A self-inflicted punishment, since no one had put a gun on my head, to accept the job. Finally, if you don't like the conditions, you leave and it's over. At the same time, I learned a lot about the misery of some people who take advantage of the fact that you are on the down. Others who, knowing that you are worth more, are left with a crop because your power of negotiation is in the mind. In fact, I remember that at one point they even asked me to write the master thesis for another person. If I didn't do it, They would learn me to a consultancy. That was good for me. However, I do not complain. In fact, if at that moment I had been liberal like now, I would have taken the situation in another way. I would not have been so angry. Therefore, all these experiences led me to learn to be much more liberal. The experience not only served to see what I was made of, but also taught me to stay in shape in the range of 75 to 80 kilos of weight. I think that being liberal, I would have had a better time, but as the saying goes, the letter with blood comes in. 6. Nielsen, Simonetti, Uranikin, Bile and Fantino. In one of the many laps of the work of the consultancy house, I was called by Leonardo Barenboim, cousin of the famous musician, and I had the honor to present an evaluation of a signature. Not only was the experience wonderful today, I called Lalo my friend, within the middle, when we were looking for funding for the project. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Guillermo Nielsen. Like Lolo, a formidable human being, good guy and extremely generous. In addition, his capacity to assimilate ideas at supersonic speed. Shortly after meeting us, Leonardo Matka, he needed a company evaluator in the group of Eduardo Uranikin, an American corporation, since there was the intention to get one of his companies out of the bag. Paraportes Argentina 2000. Leo, like Guillermo and Lolo, is a great person and very intelligent. Not only did my economic situation improve, but I also had a lot of fun working. However, one day Leo decided to change his job and he left. After the transition, I was in charge of the sector. There I began to deal with Daniel Simonassi. Daniel had a fundamental role in the group, never had gaps in the agenda, and at that time I wanted to have a lot of time to explain my vision. That generated a tense situation, and one day, with all the reason in the world, Daniel explained to me that it was almost a disrespect that I did not adjust my times of explanation to his dynamics. That was another stroke of luck. The situation forced me to change my communication strategy. I synthesized the work in no more than 5 sentences. If Daniel was interested in something, he developed it. And if not, he had the result in hand. That not only improved my relationship with Daniel, for him I have so much respect and affection, but then it would be key for my relationship with Eduardo Uranikian, who had even less time, and also for my career in the media. I still remember as if it were today. One Sunday I was invited on the program of Monero, whom I had met thanks to Carlos Arbia. They had run the program an hour back on the grid, and I, in turn, arrived an hour before the traditional time. I entered through Fitre's door, and there was only the security staff of the channel. When I pointed out that I was there as a guest of Moreo's program, they notified me of my error, and when I was about to leave, I saw skinny and tall man. He suddenly said to me, "What are you doing, Milei?" There was Morel, another addicted to work, already working very early. In that context, we went to the living room of the studio where the program was made, and there he taught me the great lesson to be in the media. You are a kid who knows a lot, but your explanations are very long. You have to think that this is like a boxing round. You have 3 minutes to tell the idea. In the first minute you have to put in a pineapple. It was clear the same model that Simonetti had asked me, and that also worked for me in the treatment with Uranikian. Without a doubt, Daniel and Moro are the great mentors, are the forceful style of Milei. Then Alejandro Fandino catapulted me in the media, when he invited me to his programa Animos Luz, which opened the door for me to be invited to intervals at the time of Santiago del Moro. But they were very generous with me. I only have words of affection and gratitude for them. I feel an infinite gratitude towards each of them. Obviously, they are not the only people for whom I feel affection and respect in the media. On the male side, luckily in chronological order, there is Carlos Macetan, Daniel Estego, Hoblo Rossi, Carlos Avia, Carlos Alcino, Tikichi, Carlos Mia, Ro Alvarendo, the brothers Francisco and Ignacio Oliverdol, Rolando Gruner, Eduardo Batalla, Eduardo Femin, Jonathan Vile, Luz Novesa, Eduardo Senalini, Roberto Gasha, Jose Del Rio, Horacio Regui, Fernando Gonzalez, Hernando Goni, Luis Maggio, and Ernesto Tenenbaum. There is no need that the bond does not go, from an ideological perspective opposite to mine, but always with respect. On the female side, I highlight the great professional work of Clara Marigny. the filial depth of Christina Perez, the warmth of Sword Library, the kindness of Carolina Lozada. In addition, I was astonished by the professionalism, work capacity and courage of Martha Ligren. I was shocked when I met Maury Cousin, a person with a superlative intelligence and an amazing emotional sensitivity. It took less than 2 minutes to get the file out. Finally, and not least, I met Viviana Canosa, a woman with moral values of iron, who is a working machine and who, little by little from the defense of both lives, and her embracing the ideas of freedom, was gaining a prominent place in the public debate. 7. The subprime crisis and the change of direction. In 2008 to 2009 they come to light and forcefully exploit the problems of global imbalance and subprime interest rates. There, one of the things that happened to me when I see Ben Bernanke's action in the face of the crisis is that I read Keynes again for the third time. I had already read it in college and I thought I had understood it. However, today I can say that I had not understood anything. The second time I read it in late postgraduate, and there to understand it, of course that it did help me a lot. Coal prices in quantities, provided by Mario Damo, and with the subprime crisis, I read it again while at the same time, I started studying Milton Friedman again. For me, until that moment, Friedman was a kind of bastard brother. Monetarism was very orthodox, which was also a phenomenal progress, because when I left college, they barely taught you to hate Friedman. In fact, in some universities, they teach that he was an accomplice killer of the Pinochet dictatorship. Something similar to what they say about Friedrich Hayek, to whom they accuse of being the one who pushed Margaret Thatcher to sink the Belgian Air Force. Without a doubt, the left has a great creativity to invent lies that have no relationship with reality. The truth is that when the subprime came, one of the things I did was to study the monetary history of the United States 1867 to 1960. In particular, Chapter 7, the Great Contraction of 1929 and 1933. It was at that moment that I began to rediscover and better understand Friedman's work, as well as Keynes's, where he came from and in what things he had contributed. At this point, it is no longer necessary to clarify that I do not share some methodological aspects and appreciations of Keynes in his general theory, but apart from that, I was better equipped to face the situation, and one of the things I perceived was that the profession began to repeat the same error that it had committed in the crisis of 1929, to ask the market to be released and the market to be cleaned, and they say it today, still being anarcho-capitalist philosophically. The problem with this recommendation was that you had a fractional deposit system. Therefore, it made no sense to give a recommendation of economic policy, ignoring the institutional framework and the conditions of the state. Reality is what it is, not what exists in my ideal case. That recommendation generated a disaster that ended in the Great Depression, and that was what allowed the arrival of Keynes' ideas. Ideas that, as everyone knows, seem nefarious to me. Then, returning to 2008-2009, my analytical framework begins to make noise. There is something that was not going well. At that time, the theory of real cycles was a fashion. I had fun with all those models. It was a phenomenon. I calibrated and simulated models, and there I discovered that there were things that were not going well. The truth is that I live from doing microeconomics, applied with things linked to regulation, but I was so tormented by what I was seeing in macroeconomics that I said, well, I'm going to specialize in economic growth, and they can all go to hell. In the end, it was the reason that motivated to investigate the nature and causes of the wealth of the nations. In a book so tedious, given the style of the time, as wonderful, strictly if it had not been for Smith's obsession with the equilibrium of stationary state, in which almost rent disappears, equaling the price with the average cost, pushing it to be wrong, embracing the theory of labor value, which is not necessary to achieve that result. The work was superlative. Smith, from my point of view, is to the economy what Carl Friedrich Gauss is to mathematics. A brilliant mind that was ahead 200 years at the time. However, professional economists did not get to see the point until Paul Riemann appeared with his doctoral thesis at the University of Chicago, tutored by Robert Lucas Jr. back in 1983. This new professional turn took me to study All the books on the courses of economic growth. In fact, the part of my library that contains those books is substantially wider than the present Amazon catalog on the subject. If I add those that I have in digital version, I win by a draw. 8. Economic growth in the way to Rockford 8.1. Approaching literature, I started away by reading the full conferences of Robert Solon, The Theory of Growth, an exposition, an introduction to the modern theories of economic growth by Howard G. Jones, and what I could see poorly in some other macroeconomics book. In turn, I added Economic Growth by Robert J. Barrow and A.B. Sala and Martin, studied in my postgraduate degree in detail, to which I soon added the second edition, and the book by Sala and Martin on economic growth. Then I started reading every economic growth book I found. I read The Endogenous Growth of the Eke Model by Solopakhin and Peter Howard, and later I also got the introductory book on a subject of the same authors. It is very interesting. See how they just the marshalling to be able to disseminate. Later I found Barrow, Sala and Martin, Paul Roma and many others. In turn, when I knew the models of endogenous growth based on creative destruction, I was able to rescue what I had studied by Joseph Schumpeter in his book, Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy. Definitely, I began a deep dive into the topics of economic growth. Reading Charles Jones was absolutely revealing. I rediscovered Robert Lucas Jr. and I got excited. I remember that I had read several times a phrase of Lucas. The consequences on human well-being of this type of issues are so overwhelming that when one begins to think about economic growth, one can never think about anything else. Prior to the arrival to the field of economic growth, I thought stupidly that it was about the vision of that professor who considers that his subject is the most important. Then, when I entered the subject, that phrase of Lucas was validated at every moment. In fact, every so often when a phrase of a colleague seems to me out of tune before executing it, I thought about it several times, and I even self-flagellate, remembering my mistake about the professor of the University of Chicago. Everything is to avoid criticizing those in a hurry and without foundations, which leads to a new era. I hate to be wrong and eat mistakes if I can. I began to think about these long-term problems, and I began to improve a lot in my analysis. However, seeing the economy as a long-term process put me in front of another problem, and it is what in literature is called the hockey stick, which has to do with the evolution of the GDP per capita between the year 1800 and the year 2000. If you look at the GDP per capita between the year 0 and the year 1800, it only 40% grows. That is to say that the world grew at a rate of 0.2% per capita per year. In other words, nothing. You need more than 3,500 years to be able to double the income per capita. On the other hand, after the Industrial Revolution, the growth rate of GDP per capita practically multiplied by 33, because it jumps to 0.65% per year. In fact, the rate at which GDP per capita grows in the first half of the 20th century jumps from 1% to 0.6%. When you look at the second half of the 20th century, the product grows to 21%. And there are studies that, taking into account the underestimation of growth in national accounts, consider that in reality the real rate at which the world grew in this period was at 3.25%. In turn, if entering the 21st century, the world was growing at 3% with a crisis in the middle, and everything, and if corrected by this effect of underestimation, it could go to growth rates of 4.20%, 4.25%. Put in other terms, and even without making this correction, with the underestimation of national accounts, it took about 500 years to be able to double GDP per capita. In the 18th century, it took 107 years. In the 19th century, it took 66 years in the first half. At the 20th century, it took 33 years in the second. Then perhaps in the 21st century, it will be only 23 years. That is, we are facing a process of acceleration of the phenomenal growth rate. If I had to put a subtitle to this, it would be Piketty, who is a fraud. In fact, when you look at the countries that duplicated the GDP, the first one that did it was the United Kingdom between 1780 and 1838, it took 58 years. The United States, which was the second, did it in 47 years, starting in 1839. The last time. The third was Japan, which did it in 34 years, starting in 1885. Italy, starting in 1890, did it in 21 years. Spain, starting in 1950, did it in 18 years. South Korea, starting in 1978, did it in 9 years. And China, starting in 1987, did it in 7 years. It is clear then that, as the history of humanity progresses, the GDP per capita doubles. That means that the growth rate is accelerating. The counterpart of this is that the series clearly takes the form of a hockey stick, where in the last 200 years, it grew much more than in the previous 18 centuries. Yes, while between the beginning of the Christian era and the 18th century, the income per capita multiplied by 4 times. In the last 2 centuries, it multiplied by 7 times. Moreover, in the history of humanity, it was as good as in this time. Let us also think that the world population in the 18th century was 1 billion human beings, and when it came to the 20th century, it was around 6,200,000,000. On the other hand, today in the world, there are about 7.8 billion human beings. This means that, among other things, the iron law of the diary of Thomas Mathunism has been a failure, and that the new versions of Mathunism, from the Club of Run to the Green Police, should internalize the recurrence of some of these errors that are leading to the murder of millions of people. In the metal room, state policy driven at the beginning of the 70s by Henry Kissinger, during the government of Richard Nixon 8.3, by Adam Smith to Murray Rothbard. Although I have a negative vision of Maths' work, and infinitely much worse about his modern followers, I have a negative vision of his location in time and place. In fact, the system explains well what happened from the Hughes era to the 1800s of the Christian era, although it did not envision what Adam Smith had managed to visualize. Smith, without knowing it, predicted the hockey stick. However, the hockey stick in economic theory implies the existence of increasing performance at scale. In turn, the increasing performance in microeconomics are called non-convexities, which have a negative implication in terms of Pareto optimal. In other words, non-convexities are associated with concentrated market structures, which imply a shift from the old optimum. However, the question is, if in the world prior to the arrival of capitalism, 95% of the world population lived in extreme poverty conditions, less than $1 a day, and today, with a population 8 times higher, at the end of the COVID pandemic, the data was below 5%. At the end of the 20th century, that data was 20%. How can it be that economic theory points out that this structure is wrong? Those concentrated structures that microeconomics treated as something bad, in real life appear with the foundation of a hockey stick, and have generated an explosion of wealth, as never before in the history of humanity. And not only that, poverty was being annihilated. So again, the question is, how the hell can it be that economists think that monopolies are bad, or that concentrated structures are bad, if empirical evidence shows that they brought a phenomenal level of well-being? Here is something that is not going well. It smells rotten. I already came from the frustration of being post-Keynesian. I came from the frustration of being neo-Keynesian. I came from the frustration of being a recalcitrant neoclassic. I came from the frustration of being a monetary economist. Something that I had to fill with good news now gave me a tremendous spine, because it made noise of the microeconomics I had studied for so many years. It was a situation of phenomenal frustration. Also, I had the sensation that, to all this literature needed a soul, there was something that I felt that handled the whole apparatus and was an aesthetically wonderful methodology, because it is also a math that produces delight because it is aesthetically beautiful, but it did not give the expected results. Where was the problem? And in the midst of that frustration that I had, in my team of economists in corporate America, a former student of mathematics of the UED appears, Federico Fali Massa, one of the co-authors of Economic Politics Against Club, along with Diego Giacomini. I remember that, talking to Federico, I told him, here there is something that smells rotten. Economic theory says that concentrated market structures are bad for well-being. And look at the data. Increasing performance and a phenomenal drop in poverty. Where is that wrong? Then, an article by Murray Rothbard, translated by Alberto Venegas Lynch, the father of Alberto Venegas Lynch's son. The article is part of the book, The Man, the Economy and the State. The chapter is called Monopoly and Competence. It is about 140 pages. I read it in an afternoon. And when I finished, I said, everything I was teaching for more than 20 years of market structures is wrong. Why? Because the approach of the neoclassical economy of markets is based more on the support of the mathematical structure than on the conceptual basis. The classic example of this is the monopoly. According to the neoclassical theory, it is, and according to the Austrians, what it is if it is a monopoly derived from the action of the state. Let's get to the point. Let's think of 10 companies that sell cell phones. Suddenly one makes a development that allows you to offer the best cell phone at a lowest price. What is the result? The remaining 9 companies get broke. Now there is only one company, a monopoly. Don't try to convince yourself that it's bad. It's not. That monopoly is a social benefactor. You have to applaud it. This resulted in a phenomenal shock to my way of thinking. There was born the Austrian. I was already getting to know myself, because it coincided with the time when we published Economic Policy Against the Cock. Grateful had a section called The Economist of the Week. Andy Comini played his turn in the column a few days after the publication of the book. He spoke with Rodolfo Barres, who was managing the section at that time, and he proposed to publish a summary of the book. Then, instead of Giacomini's face, he would go to the cover of the book, obviously signed by the 3 authors. The article was called Stuck by the Grace of Rodriguez. The note came out on a Saturday, and put together such a mess that the profile page fell. On Monday the crisis would burst, in which Juan Carlos Fabregat devalued, and the dollar went from 6 pesos to 9, to 60. It was a momentous dizzy heights, because we had published the article on Saturday, and on Monday everything was bursting. There I started to get to know myself. This is funny because there is a talk, in which one of the liberal foundations makes a report to Ricardo Lopez Murphy, with whom I had given many conferences, and they asked him for expert about me. Jose Luis said, he's a classic liberal. And then, when they asked him about me, Ricardo answered, I knew him as an expert in economic growth. He is a mathematician economist from FAST. Reading Milei's academic works is not for reading on a holiday. They say in the same way. They are writings that require sitting on the chair and working. But then he became famous for something else. And so it was. I ended up being popular for my defense of freedom. 9. The Austrian School and the Definitive Path to Freedom. After reading Monopoly and Competition by Murray Rothbard, I remember that I was so impressed that I started looking for material in the same line, which took me to a bookstore on Salguero Street. There I met Patricia and Rodolfo Distel, who work in the edition books for Editorial Union. I know that he is in charge of publishing titles in the Austrian School, and I started buying Austrian books. I remember it was Saturday. I had gone with a certain amount of money, and I bought about 20 books. I was left without a handle, just for the taxi. And then, as I was missing books that I wanted to buy, I separated the money I needed to eat on the weekend. That's what I had to spend on moving to the bookstore, to buy the rest. That's how I started reading Ludwig van Mises. It was a way of going. I remember that I read from end to end The Human Action, a book that must have been about 1,300 pages. I liked it so much that I bought it again and kept it pristine, in new, with the cover and everything, so that it does not get damaged. And in parallel I bought the used version to take to the office. There I underline it. I put in annotations. Everything. In the free time I read it.